Welcome, class. So this is our first lecture, and we're going to treat it as an introduction to animal studies, which is more or less the the discipline that we're going to be using throughout the semester. And the first thing to note about it is that it's not really one discipline. It's a trend that has rippled through a whole host of disciplines in the humanities and outside the humanities. The past 30 years or something like that. So what we're going to do, I'm going to give you just a brief introduction of what animal studies is. Then we're going to have a quick, single case study, an example from a work of art, which you're going to watch. And then I brought in a few other examples, and some examples that pertain to the reading for today. A very famous and very early essay by John Berger called Looking at Animals, which has now become a classic text. So we'll talk a little bit about that because that'll be your reading for today. So basics first, right? That's always good. Animal studies, or you might hear it called critical animal studies, broadly speaking, analyzes the role of animals, of non-human animals across time, past and present. So the role of animals in history. The discipline of history for the longest time was basically only the history of human events or of human dealings. But beginning in the 90s, and much more recently, you have historians who start to study history not only from what we would call an anthropocentric position, where humans are at the center of everything, but started to study history from the vantage point of animals and of non-human beings and the role they've played in history. And at first you think, wait, that doesn't make any sense. History is like a human thing, and it is very likely that only humans can do history or have a history in the sense that we have a history through writing, through all the ways in which we archive our experiences. But if you think about it, that history that we write has been indelibly shaped by non-human animals of all kinds. So the most pertinent one for us today, as we're living through a pandemic, which has completely altered our history. It's altered our lives. It's altered the GDP of this country. It's the lowest GDP the biggest drop in GDP on record. This is all due to the body of a bat or a pangolin, halfway across, all the way across the world, and a virus that was hosted by that body, that then made its way through a global economy and through global travel and so on and so forth to more or less saturate the world in this pandemic. So people who are going to be writing in the future about this moment, they're going to be writing about the human response to COVID and this coronavirus, but they're also going to have to talk about the coronavirus itself and the way its origins are zoonotic, the way in which its origins come from a non-human body. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later on this semester, I hope. I've just been writing a paper on on the history of these zoonotic diseases. But almost every single epidemic or pandemic, whether it's the Spanish flu of 1918, or swine flu, or bird flu, or SARS, or MERS, all these pandemics and epidemics that we've had, every single one comes from the body of a domesticated non-human animal, and not like a quote-unquote exotic foreign animal like a bat or a pangolin, but a pig or a cow or a chicken. Right. So when you study the history of these diseases, which have shaped human history, I mean, just think of the Black Plague. This was a correspondence between humans, rats, and the lice that carried the plague. Which, incidentally, I just heard the other day that someone just contracted the plague by eating a marmot. So all these things, these history of these diseases, which have shaped human history, have been in part shaped by the animal bodies that have hosted these diseases. So that's just one example of many. Think of the history of space travel. The first living things to go out in space were not humans, but was actually a dog, a very famous dog, Laika. So I could give you examples and examples and examples running down the list of how history has been informed by animals, even though they themselves did not write the history or couldn't read the history, right? So it's a very interesting way of opening up onto our past. But it's not just history, and don't worry, I'm not going to spend this much time on every single category. It's just to give you an idea. Like the history of philosophy has always been the history of human thought, right? But recently, a lot of philosophers go back and say, wait a second, basically all of philosophy is predicated on the idea that there's a strict separation between human reason and nature and animals that are different from us, right? It's almost predicated on this division, and it's a division that hasn't stood the test of time, especially begin with Darwin. We'll talk about this next class. So philosophy itself comes to be reevaluated through animal studies. So does anthropology. So the study of human societies. What role have animals played in the history of human societies? Very large ones. What about the history of science, of all sorts of sciences, especially biology, the understanding of our own bodies, and even today, the way in which medications interact with our bodies? They're usually tested on animals that are close to us, or sometimes not that close to us, like lab mice. So the history of science is indelibly marked and influenced by animals. Of course, the history of the study of nature itself, ecology and environmentalism, and ecosystems, and the way in which we understand our planet cannot be understood without the role of other species, of which we are one. But then in the humanities, you'll also have the study of culture, the way in which animals have influenced culture and cultural production. So things like literature, right? I'm sure you can think of, in 5 seconds, you can think of a very famous book that in some way has to do with an animal, right? Like Jack London, or Edgar Allan Poe, The Raven, or Moby Dick, Herman Melville. I mean, you just go on and on and on. So if you're going to study literature in a broad sense, there's going to be all sorts of opportunities and places where animals have influenced the writing. And then, of course, for this class, what we're going to focus on most are the visual arts. So artists who have been influenced or in some ways deal with the question of animals in the broadest sense. In this class, we are spending most of the time, as far as like looking at examples, looking at artists and artworks and performances and installations and that sort of thing. But always keep in mind that this is because we're doing an animal studies course, and because my specialty is in animal studies, it's going to be an inherently multidisciplinary course. So each session, actually, we in some ways go off to a different discipline while looking at art. So sometimes it'll be ethology, sometimes it'll be feminism, sometimes it will be more strictly within the domain of philosophy. We're always going to be venturing off into different places and seeing where it takes us by focusing on the role of the animal and all those things. So that's just a broad introduction to sort of the methodology, to the discipline that we're working with in this class in these next in this semester. So we're going to go from this sort of general definition that I've given you to a specific example, because that's always good when you ground these sort of way too general, these big generalizations. When you ground it in a specific example, it's always helpful. And so what we're going to do next, we're going to look at a film by Chris Marker. Chris Marker was a wonderful filmmaker and artist. He's French. And he's probably most famous, well known for a short film that he did called La Jetée from the early 60s, which is just a classic science fiction film. If you've never seen it, and if you have some time, it's definitely one to watch. It's on Vimeo. It's available online. You can see the whole thing. It's a wonderful film. He also did a film in the early 70s called Three Cheers for the Whale. Originally, it was called Vive la Baleine, Long Live the Whale, basically. So it's in French, but it's also been. He also did an English version because he wanted this to be disseminated far and wide. This is a film that has to do with the history of whaling. And in 1972 is a really important year for the history of ecology and for the history of fighting for the cause of whale conservation. It's actually the year where a moratorium is imposed on whale hunting. And so this history of whaling is in some ways an activist kind of film, but it's a work of art. It's a visual document. It's a film. So what I want us to do is I've embedded this this short film on the website. So right now, pause this video, watch the film, and this is what you want to do with almost every class, because remember, you're going to be writing responses, and you really want to hone in on the things you find most interesting to be able to elaborate on in your writing when you're synthesizing the course content. So write down brief themes that are interesting to you that come out of this film. It's about 17 minutes long. And start thinking about all the ways in which something that seems to be just about whales actually touches on much larger questions that go beyond whales, and show you that actually being attentive to the animal sends you off to these much larger questions about society, about politics, about environmentalism, and so on and so forth. So just jot down, just a few words here, like key themes that just come out at you as you're watching it, but also just enjoy it. It's a great film. One last little warning, though: at the end of the film, it is violent. You do see an industrialized whale hunt. There's a lot of blood. And I've watched this so many times because I actually wrote on it in my dissertation when I was a PhD student, and every time it doesn't get easier to watch. It's not fun towards the end. So just a fair warning that there are images of violence. So pause this video, go watch the Markers film, and then we'll reconvene when you're done. Okay, so you've watched Markers' film. I hope you liked it. I hope you jotted down some ideas and some notes and some themes that came out of it. What I'm going to offer you now, since we can't have like a one-to-one discussion, I'm going to give you my themes, and you'll see if some of them sync up with yours. And this will just be a nice introduction to how are we going to approach specific works of art through this scope of animal studies. So one of the first things we would want to talk about is the history of representation. And representation has a rich history, this word, something being represented. And there are lots of different ways of interpreting representation. And from this film, one of my big takeaways, and I wonder if it was one for you, the film seems to be split between older forms of representation, like prints and those cartoons at the beginning, or that whale taxonomy. It's actually a book at the beginning of the film. Paintings. Can you imagine these colonial ships that explored the world beginning in the 1500s? That they had painters on board that then they would document things, right? They didn't invent photography. Won't be invented for another 300 years. So you had painters on board painting these hunts, right? So at the beginning of the film, you have these much older forms of representation. And then at the end of the film, you have a different form of representation, which is through photography and film. And these are very distinct because these first forms of representations are all in some ways mediated by a human hand and a human mind, which means a human culture and a tradition, and all these dogmas and biases about nature, about whales, and also ignorance, right? Imagine what we know today about cetaceans. Whales are cetaceans. They're incredibly intelligent, social. They're really incredible beings. People in the 1500s, 1600s had no idea about this. They didn't know. They didn't know what a whale really was. And so naturally, all these representations at the beginning are all going to be misleading. They're not going to show you the reality of the situation. Whereas film, there is something about film The framing, yes, like an artist or a filmmaker, they're making choices with framing. In the editing process, there are things that can be done, but really, there is something fundamentally different about film, in that it is giving you access to reality in a way a drawing or a painting doesn't, because that's mediated by the experience of the artist who makes it. So the end of of Chris Marker's Vive la Baleine, where you see the hunt and you see these factory farm ships that are like killing all these whales and hauling them up and rendering them already on board of the ship. All these things are more like activist imagery. Like they're showing the truth of the situation. And if you're very attentive to the way the film unfolds, notice how the whale hunt at the end, it's this grisly, like pretty gory, not very romantic thing. You can't even see very much. You just hear things and then you see blood in the water. It's nothing like all those dramatic, stylized representations from the beginning of the film, especially those like romantic paintings and seascapes, right? So this is a really wonderful example of a film that shows you how the history of representation plays out, and in two different ways. Representation is something that would be misleading, that doesn't give you the truth of the thing that's being represented, which nonetheless has very real effects on people's minds and on history and on culture. But then also representation as a form of revealing, as a form of even activism in the case of this film. So these two forms of representation I want you to keep in mind really throughout the whole semester. We're going to be attentive to them. And I'm sure this distinction you're going to be using when you do your own presentations for this class. Okay, so there's also a history of science that unfolds across this film. Talking about whales is not only talking about the hunt, but it's also about the whole history of taxonomy, of marine biology, of natural sciences, and of exploration, and the ways in which human scientific knowledge has been predicated on the study of these non-human bodies, right? And so a historian of science could watch this film and then start talking about the history of biology itself, right? We also have the history of technology. Technology seems to be the thing that's furthest away from like the natural world and from animals. But if we're attentive to this film, we see that Marker is actually tracing a history of changing technology, which has large effects. So we go from, this is just the history of the hunt that he traces here. We go from like hand harpoons, which are used more for like subsistence hunting, right, where only a few whales can be killed at a time, to these very large, massive industrial ships, and then the invention of Freund's explosive gun, right, which now it can be, it can almost become like a factory farm on the ocean, where you can harvest lots and lots and lots of whales, right? So this is a history of technology that's being laid out, which will have ecological, political, and social effects, which Marker also unfolds. You also have a history of energy in this film. So before we became addicted to fossil fuels, which has led to all sorts of climate problems, most of all global warming and the emission of CO2s and the changing of our the thermal composition of our planet, making it warmer and less hospitable, less inhabitable for us. Before you had oil from fossil fuels, oil came from sperm whales. And so in some sense, Marker is giving you a prehistory of our oil, our fossil fuel economy that we live in now, that we're desperately hoping the politics will change, that we get off these fossil fuels, we go towards more a green economy or a Green New Deal, in order to avert the worst of what we know is coming down the pipe. So this film is also giving you a history of energy and a history of oil, which is predicated on the body of these body of these whales. So you can already tell we're just by being attentive to the animal here. This is much more than simply an activist film about the history of whaling, it's opening up onto all these other large questions. One of the largest would be seeing this film as a history of global capitalism, of the idea, which in human history is somewhat recent, that anything can be turned into a commodity, that nature, anything out there, can simply be regimented, scaled up, and then in some ways used for making commodities, and then ultimately for making profit. Capitalism at its core is a system that makes profit and creates wealth, right? So here you're seeing the history of this economic system from subsistence hunting, which would be a pre-capitalist mode, right? These are just people who live in places where they need to have subsistence. And so they're not hunting to make profit, they're hunting as part of their culture, they're hunting as a form of survival and of living. We go from that, which is arguably pre-capitalist, to these floating factory ships that you see at the end, where they get as many whales as they can to get as much out of them as they can to make as much profit out of them as they can. So reducing nature, and in this case whales, to simply products, right? And the problem here is that there's no discussion of what this does to the environment. There's no discussion as to what these whales actually are, their intelligence, their sociability, the fact that they live in pods, all these things. Like, these are not considered within this history of global capitalism, which really is only interested in GDP and profit making and accruing wealth. Right? So Marker, I think you can tell from the film, is tracing this history in order to be critical of it. Marker was very much an artist of the left, who was in many ways anti-capitalist and thought that capitalism was ruining things. Right? And this film is definitely a testament to that kind of idea. There's also the history of colonization that's being traced in here, and you probably saw this in the film. So he isn't only talking about whales when he's talking about these modes of exploration that began in the 1500s. These are also entangled with histories of colonization and exploration and the domination of other humans who were deemed quote-unquote savage, right? And in many cases throughout history, the savage, the human quote-unquote savage, will be animalized, will be treated as an animal, and animals will also be, weirdly enough, animalized, will be treated as things that can just be debased, that can just be exploited, that can just be harvested. And these two ideas of the savage and the animal as something to be plundered and hunted and so on and so forth, these things actually worked together. And they reinforce themselves. And so Marker is showing you representations, old representations, not only of animals, but also representations of non-white, non-European peoples. And so this is a history that works together. And clearly, this is the middle part of the film, clearly Marker is also critical of that history, the way in which Europeans treated non-white European peoples as savages and as animals to be exploited, as non-human animals are exploited. There's also another theme in Marker's film that really gets to well, all these things are still with us, of course, but we have just entered into what Elizabeth Kolbert and a number of science studies people are calling the Sixth Extinction, the sixth mass extinction. And if you're interested in this, I would advise reading Kolbert's The Sixth Extinction. It's very good. The Sixth Extinction basically means that we've had 5 mass extinction events on the history of this planet. So one of the most famous the theory is in the Yucatan. There was a big meteor that hit and that wiped out the dinosaurs. That's one of the mass extinctions events of this planet. The Sixth Extinction, the one we're undergoing now, is different because whereas every other mass extinction event was from a source outside This one is actually on our watch. This is actually anthropogenic. This is human-made extinction because of global warming, because of industry, and in large part because actually the biggest driver of species extinction is animal agriculture, especially deforestation and the incursion of into ecosystems and wildlands in order to make in order to practice industrial animal farming and other forms of farming like timber and that sort of thing. And so every day, I don't know the numbers, but they're mind-boggling. We lose a species. We lose many species every single day as we've entered into this mass extinction event. And so it's really sad. It's really depressing. And probably the first time the idea of species extinction and endangered species becomes like part of cultural awareness would be in the 60s and 70s. And amazingly enough, Nixon is the one who you think back of as a very right-wing president, and he was, but he's the one who signs into law the Endangered Species Act, which is very interesting. But it's around the 60s and 70s where this idea of species extinction becomes a cultural issue, and one of the biggest one because they're so charismatic and they're so wonderful. Whales became a huge cultural and political touchstone at the time, and fears of overhunting and of leading to their endangerment and eventual extinction became a big social and political issue at the time. So much so that there was actually, I think I said this already, there was a moratorium on the whale hunt started in 1972. And so whales were a big success story when it comes to conservation and when it comes to environmental politics. So very, very interesting. He's giving you this history of endangered species and species extinction. He's also giving us maybe one of the thorniest issues when it comes to studying the animal within human culture. And that would be this divide, which in some ways feels irreconcilable. This divide between tradition, the things that we have always done, or that other cultures have always done, that later on in history are deemed to be, for various reasons, either unethical or environmentally unsustainable or just simply wrong, right? This is very thorny. And Marker, in some ways, it'd be interesting to hear what you think, but in Marker's film, it's almost as if it's like this is too easy of a question for him. It's very easy for him to say the Japanese, that's maybe one of the uneasiest parts of the film for me, where he seems to be a little bit biased against Japanese culture as somehow inherently barbaric and inherently cruel when it comes to whaling. Or what about Inuits, or the people living in the Azores who have farmed and hunted for whales as their tradition for centuries, for as long as they can remember, right? Who are we to go in and say, no, within the rules of ethics, you can't justify this is wrong, or within a paradigm of environmentalism, no, you can't do this is wrong because these species are going to be extinct. We seem to have this is like a tough cookie. Like we have an almost irreconcilable tug and pull or tension between tradition and ethics and environmentalism, and it becomes all the trickier because if you think about it, the way we understand the law, the way we understand ethics, it's very much, for the most part, a paradigm that comes through the history of the West, right? But what about non-Western paradigms of thinking and of ethics? Are there other forms of ethics? Within a Western paradigm of ethics, any appeal to tradition or to nature is a fallacy. To say, oh yeah, we've always done it, will not hold mustard in a court of law or in a debate, in an ethical debate. Just because you've done something for a long time doesn't make it right, right? So this is very, very tricky, and these are issues that we really want to keep in mind as we're talking about the role of animals in history. Another interesting thing that Marker does is undoing the nature-culture binary. And for most of the history of the West, in certain non-Western cultures, this will be different. But in the West, especially when you get to the modern period, it's almost founded on an understanding that we have culture and humans on one side, and nature and non-humans on the other. That there's a divide, that it's a binary, that these are two separate things, and they're opposed. But notice what Marker does at the end of the film really well. He says that this binary has come undone. We no longer have nature on one side and humans on the other and culture on the other, but everything's become scrambled. And what we really have are people that are for nature and people who are against it. Right? So it's a very interesting way of undoing the binary. And this gets us to issues of environmentalism and ecology, where we now understand that we're not outside of the environment, and in fact, the stuff that we're doing that's harming the environment, we're also harming ourselves because we can't get outside of it. We're not outside of nature. We're not outside of the planet. So it's a very interesting thing that Marker does in 1972, which is very prescient, very astute of him to do. And then the final thing I want to call your attention on, because this is going to be really important for our class, is the ways in which Marker's film shows you that animals can have agency. Agency is I guess, a kind of a fancy term for anything that seems to have its own volition, its own will, its own preferences, its ability to do things in its life, in its daily experience, like to prefer certain things and to not prefer others. It attests to itself. Agency is you having the power to decide what your life is like, right? And as you can imagine, for a long time, there was a bias that only humans had agency, and that animals are simply, these instinctual machines that don't really have agency. But as you'll learn during our next class, this is an idea that completely doesn't hold water. All sorts of different animals have all sorts of different agencies. They can attest to their inner lives, they can attest to their preferences, and they seem to will. They seem to have volition. And so in Marker's film, you see this a lot. So there's this incredible moment where he talks about how whales helped explorers navigate the oceans, and this is true. To help navigate waterways and the ways in which currents roll throughout the oceans. They followed whales. So it's as if they used whale knowledge and whale agency in order to navigate planetary exploration. But then there are other more direct forms of animal agency in the film. So animals that seem to be the whales that seem to be resisting, that seem to be evading, that seem to be feeling pain, that are vocalizing distress and suffering. Right? This would all be a form of agency. This would all be a form of non-human agency. And towards the end of the film, Marker really makes this makes a strong case for animal agency through the images that he uses. So those are just a few of the themes that I pull out for you from this work by Chris Marker, which I hope convinces you that being attentive to the animal, in this case whales, leads you to all sorts of different, very large historical, social, cultural issues and economic issues. And then it can be really rewarding to study all these things through the role of animals. And I'd be interested in your responses if you do end up writing about Marker for this class in your synthesis of these first three classes. For next Friday, I'll be interested to hear if any of your themes sort of match up with some of the themes I brought out, or if it's very possible, like you've found something different that's really interesting to talk about that comes out of Marker's film. So, okay, so let's round out this discussion. I wanted to bring in another example just to make animals representation is very important. So I wanted to bring in another example. This would be a comparison between Jaws this very classic film from 1977, if I remember correctly, or 75, which scared basically like everybody at the time. And if you've seen it, it is still, yeah, it's a wonderful film. But it can definitely be a scary film to watch, pretty intense. So you have Jaws, and on the one hand, so a cultural artifact from the 1970s, and then something from last year. This is an oceanographer. Her name is Ocean Ramsey. If you're born with the first name Ocean, I think if that was her real name, you're almost like fated to become an oceanographer. She came upon a rarely seen, very large female great white, who's named Deep Blue. This shark is famous enough to scientists and to people that she actually has a name. And she was just quietly gliding about. This is, I think, off the coast of Hawaii. And this oceanographer was able to get up close, was able to film, was even able to like pet and touch Deep Blue. And she just very gently glided by. And never seemed to be a threat in any way. And so for Ocean Ramsey, the point, and she talks about this, like this was in the news, this was more or less everywhere. For Ocean Ramsey, this was not, okay, get in the water and have fun with sharks. That's not the point. The point is to know that sharks are not simply just these killing machines. Jaws, one of the things that's difficult about Jaws is not that it's scary, but that it actually led to a deep hatred of sharks and a deep fear of sharks. Peter Benchley is the guy who wrote the book Jaws that Steven Spielberg adapted and then made the film off of. Later on, he regrets having written Jaws in the way he did, because he started studying sharks, and he started to realize that sharks are completely misunderstood, that they're not just these dumb killing machines out in the ocean. And he says if he could do it over again, he would write it differently, or I think he maybe even says he wouldn't write it at all. So here we get to another concrete example of representation as misrepresentation, and then representation as something closer to the reality, right? That sharks are important for the ecosystem, that sharks are not necessarily always going to be just these man-eating beasts, but they have, they have a much more complex form of life, one that should be respected, right? This is the thing that Ocean Ramsey says in her writings about this experience. She says this is about like having awe, and not simply being afraid and having hatred and wanting to go, just like kill sharks. This is about having awe, having respect for them, keeping your distance, but also understanding that they're complex creatures, right? Whereas Jaws reduces the shark to just this mindless killing machine to be afraid of. And in fact, sharks are likely far more afraid of us than we are of them, or at least they should be, because millions of sharks get killed every year, either for food or as bycatch in fishing industries. And a lot of sharks are becoming, or have been for a while now, endangered, right? They're in trouble. So the irony of Jaws is that it's not so much we should be afraid of sharks, even though, of course, we probably should be very careful. It's sharks who should be afraid of us because we're killing so many of them. So it's interesting because as I was preparing this lecture, and I like giving this example, there was an attack, and this is tragic, but off the coast of Maine, just a few days ago, there was an attack. A woman was killed off the coast of Maine by a great white shark. And so, of course, this is tragic, and this is terrible. And you'd think that this would reinforce the great white or sharks as these horrible things that we need to go out and have revenge, and we got to go kill them. But it's very interesting how this was reported on a major news source. This is The Guardian, which reflects how the representation of sharks have changed over time since the 70s. I even think like a decade ago, it would never have been reported like this. But the reporting was that this was a tragic event. But then it doesn't go on to say, sharks are evil. We should go out and like eradicate them so this doesn't happen again. The reporting has more to do with an explanation as to how and why it happened, which isn't which has nothing to do with the shark wanting to kill and eat a human. Um, the 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 shark mistook this woman for a seal because of the clothing she was wearing, like a dark suit that makes her look like that made her be confusable with a seal. And furthermore, this article goes in and tells you that there have been conservation efforts for seal populations. So more and more seals have come back, which means that their natural predators in the wild will also be coming back. And so the story goes in and describes what a tragic incident this was, but also tries to explain and says that this is because of conservation efforts and that we should really be careful. Whenever there are seals around, you should probably not go out and swim near the seals because there will likely be a great white, a natural predator, circling about, and you might get confused for a seal, right? And at the very end of this article, there's a marine biologist who says when you go out in the ocean, it's like going into a forest. You're not sovereign. You're not the master of the forest. If you come upon a bear, you have to know what to do. You have to be very respectful, and you have to be very careful. And there's inherent danger. And so it's the same thing in the ocean. You're not in your natural element, right? So there's a paradigm shift here. For the longest time, humans just basically thought we control the planet. We are the masters of everything, and we can dominate everything, right? This seems to be an idea that's being scaled back here, and to say, no, actually, we're not the king of the ocean here. That we should be respectful and we should be careful, and we should not try to dominate every situation. So it's a much more subtle reporting of this tragic, sad event, which has everything to do with what we've just been describing. And then keeping our shark theme going, one last work, one last example. This is actually a work of art by a duo named Ali and Susie. This is Shark Bite from 1987. This is a photograph of the work. It's not the work itself. Their work is the work you're seeing in the water. It's a painting of this shark. So Ali and Susie are known for going out into endangered habitats, and they'll draw or paint underwater. How they do this, I don't know exactly. Like they use special pens and special paint, but they'll go in and try to get as close as possible to an endangered animal within their habitat. So in this case, they're underwater with this is the tail of a whale shark, and whale sharks are very gentle. The whale sharks will only eat krill and plankton and that sort of thing. So they're not a danger. They're the biggest shark that we have underwater. So they're following the shark and trying to document the shark. And so this is their practice. And they actually work together. They work on the same drawing, always. They're always drawing at the same time, and they're working on the same drawing together. And so for this one, this became a very iconic image of their work. It's a photograph by Greg Williams. They went underwater in a cage, of course, respectfully. You're not going to stupidly try to do a portrait of a great white shark without protection. So they were underwater in a cave, in a cage, and they tried to represent this shark. And then at the end, they offer up the painting or the drawing to the shark itself, who then came up and bit part of it, and then wasn't interested in the painting. Realized this is not tasty, and so just let it go. And so the work itself was actually marked and touched by the subject, by the shark itself, right? And again, they're not doing this for anything sensational. They're doing it to have like a direct experience with an endangered creature, as a way of bringing visibility and awareness to endangered animals. And to habitats that have been encroached upon, right? So just a nice example, staying in the theme of the water that we have for this class. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about these examples I brought in. These are just to sort of whet your appetite for John Berger's essay, what you'll be reading for today, called Why Look at Animals. It's a very ambitious essay. It almost tries to give a whole history of animals in human knowledge, in human culture and society. And one of the things he talks about quite a bit once you get to the 19th and 20th century, he writes this in 1977, is the history of zoos and what zoos have provided or do not provide. Right? This is a very important part of his argument that you'll be reading. So I thought I would bring in a couple examples of works that have to do with his essay. So he dedicates the essay to Gilles Layot, a French painter, who did a lot of these paintings in zoos. So here you have a hippopotamus that's confined within this very like modern zoo structure, right? So that's an example. These are all examples you could talk about in your writing of Berger's essay and of this lecture. There's also another work by Chris Marker that I can show you. It's much shorter. It's part of these video. He got himself like one of the earliest video cameras, and he went out and made these little video pieces. All of them had to do with animals. They're called his bestiary pieces, and this one is called Zoo Piece, which is beautiful, melancholic. A beautiful melancholic piece that fits very well with Berger's essay. So I'll go ahead and show it to you. It's like 4 minutes long.
Амур его зовут. Амур, Амур, Амур.
So you could certainly write about Chris Marker's Zoo Piece in your longer essay at the end of this week. He also talks about the very earliest representations of animals. This is Chauvet Cave. I wanted to show it to you. This is the Cave of the Lions. It's an incredible cave in France. So his argument, well, you'll read about it. There's something very different about these animals, the conception of these animals, than our conception today of animals, or the more modern conception of animals. So bring in that example for you. Also brought in a print of Granville. He talks about Granville. I think this is the most confusing part of his text. So no worries if it doesn't really translate very well. I think he could have written his ideas clearer here. But it's one of the interesting things going all the way back to Aesop's fables or Fontaine, La Fontaine. Think of like the tortoise and the hare, or that sort of thing. Animals have become surrogates for human behaviors. Think of just how it's encoded in everyday language. Like if someone calls you a pig, you're like sloppy, or you're like dirty or whatever, which is interesting because actually pigs are very clean creatures. The only reason they roll around in mud and all that stuff on a farm is because they can't sweat like we do, and so it's their way of keeping cool. If they lived in the wild, they would have shade. They would have natural ways of keeping cool. They're actually cleanly creatures. So even in language can represent reality in misleading ways. So this is a Granville print where the dog becomes like a human type, like a human character, right? Then, of course, we have the history of animation, the history of cartoons. Berger talks about this a bit too. This is, I think, the first representation, the first Donald Duck, which is almost the reverse. Now this is the animal taking on human qualities, right? And then the whole world of most children begins immersed and surrounded by animals, which is always a weird thing because like kids love animals and animals are everywhere. And then once you sort of grow up, it's just you kind of, unless you start to specialize or you're in some ways impassioned by animals. Most people, it's just something they forget about, right? And they don't even think about the animals that are around them, either living or dead, right? So it's an interesting thing. And then I couldn't resist rounding out our lecture, going back to the shark theme. Berger could not have known this, the world of online videos, but this is the very famous Zumba Shark cat, which maybe you've seen, maybe you haven't. You could probably spend like a whole page just writing about what this video means, and how animals are used and understood today in online culture and memes and that sort of thing. And so just to finish this off, one of the things I'm asking you to do in this course, as you're kind of working independently, is to present your own video, is to make a presentation on an example within visual culture. That's not a work of art, but something in visual culture that has to do with animals in some ways. And so choosing a meme like this could be an interesting thing to write on. Right? What does it mean to dress up your cat and your baby as a shark, and then have the cat like roam around in a Roomba? Like, what does this mean? There might even be like some dark elements here that you could bring out, right? But however funny this might be, it actually might point to some disturbing parts of online culture or contemporary society. So this is the type of example you could work on, although it doesn't have to be a meme. It can be just about anything that you experience or see within visual culture that has to do with an animal. Okay, everybody, so that's the end of our first lecture. I hope you have a good grounding and understanding of what animal studies is. And then starting next class, we're gonna venture off towards different disciplines and lots of different examples from the past 30 years of art. So until then.